We want to spend some time thinking about evolution because the evolution of species is really tied, of course, to their ecological environments. So when we think about evolution, we can define it in a couple of different ways. One way is just that it's the change in the genetics that any population has over time or across generations. Over longer periods of time, however, we can get separation when we have genetic isolation between two gene pools. Then over long time periods that can lead to speciation, formation of whole new species, and then over even longer time periods, of course, differences in genera or even higher order taxonomic differences. Now, because the environment influences which genotypes are going to make it to the next generation, ecology and evolution are really intricately entwined. And we've already seen quotes from Evelyn Hutchinson, this very prominent ecologist, talking about the niche, but he also has this very famous quote talking about this relationship between ecology and evolution, where he calls it the ecological theater and the evolutionary play. So evolution plays out within this broader ecological context. So it makes sense when we think about the history of ecology to actually think about it starting with Darwin. And in many ways, if you read Darwin, you'll see lots of examples of where he talks about ecological phenomenon, whether that's population ecology or food webs and interaction webs or even trophic cascades. Now, he didn't have the language that we have today to describe these, but he's definitely thinking about how all of these interactions will influence species. And also, he talks about population ecology, population biology, right? When thinking about the fact that the world doesn't get overrun by species that would otherwise have exponential growth, right? So what that then leads him to start thinking about what kind of checks the environment provides on species and what the outcomes of that will be. And of course, we know that today to be where he comes up with his ideas of natural selection. So the term ecology is actually relatively new, about 150 years old or so, and it was first used by the zoologist Ernst Haeckel in 1866. And before that, people would primarily describe themselves as naturalists. So they would go out and they would classify and collect species for museums and that type of thing. Now, we tend to think of evolution as being this very slow and gradual process. You can see that in the meme here on the left of Darwin. However, when we think of it as just the change in the genetics of populations over time, then we start to realize that it's actually happening every single moment on the earth, because some genotypes are dying, some are reproducing, and that genetic composition is shifting through time. And so one way to maybe get your head wrapped around this is to try to think about how you might be influencing the evolution of other species, right? So if you want to think about your gut flora and the drugs you take and how that might influence them, you could think about that. I prefer to think about squirrels, right? So if you hit a squirrel on your way into campus, right, then that genotype is out of the population. Is that natural selection, or is that just genetic drift? These are ways in which you can start to wrap your head around these concepts. And we know that humans do have impacts on other species. In this case, we're looking at the impact of hunting as a selective force on these bighorned rams. Now we know when people hunt, they tend to want to get the very largest individual for their trophy, right? So they will selectively kill the rams that have the largest horns. So what we see in the figure is how that pressure on this population has resulted in a decrease in the average weight of the rams and also a decrease in their average horn length over time. So what's happening is we go into these populations, we take out those larger males, right, that have the biggest horns and are the heaviest through hunting. What that does is it leaves the smaller males that have smaller horns there to reproduce with the females, and over time you get lower and lower weights and horn lengths. Now with the rams, we didn't actually have the genetic shift, right? We just know that there are genetic components to weight and horn size. For some species, though, we can actually see the shift in the genetics because we know what genes are associated with in this case, the different morphologies. So this is showing for this species of fox that has these different fur morphologies, how over time, again, hunting has led to a decrease in this little a allele over time. Now, you need for these foxes to have that coat that you see in the photo, that silver fur, you need to be homozygous in that recessive little a allele. And what you can see is over time a decrease in that, right? And that's because those were more highly prized, and hunters would get more money for bringing in one of these silver-furred foxes than the red fur. So over time, that pressure on the fox population led to removal of the silver fur and the change in the genetics toward the higher dominance of the big A allele in the population over time. So again, this is humans through hunting serving as a selection force and influencing the evolution of species. Now, when we talk about this is an example of what we call microevolution, and that is because we're just talking about changes within the species of fox or the species of ram. And of course, that's different from macroevolution, right? When we look at the billions of years of evolutionary history on the Earth and how that has over time created all of the divergences that we see. And this is when we tend to think about evolution more as descent with modification over these longer time periods that create these broad changes. And so this is a diagram from your book showing over 15,000 years how for this particular group of fish, we can see the morphological change in this case, the decreasing size of this pelvic bone. Now, I know all of you probably think you already understand this, but having graded a lot of exams, what I can say is that it seems simple, but it's hard to get it right. So evolution is one of those things that it has simple rules, but it can be tricky to talk about in the correct manner because it's very important that you understand the order in which certain things take place. And the wonderful thing is that these very complex, amazing adaptations, for example, arise out of this fairly simple process. So right now we're talking about adaptive evolution. And what are our basic tenets? The first tenet is individuals within a species are not identical, so you have variation. The second tenet is that some component of that variation is heritable, right? So that's the genetic piece, and so it's going to be able to be passed on to the next generation. Then we have situations where the environment means that some individuals survive and reproduce and others don't. And so that's going to be natural selection, or if we weren't talking about an adaptive evolution, if we were just talking about evolution broadly, we could also include drift. Focusing on the adaptive piece, though, if we have certain characteristics that enhance the survival and reproduction of an individual, right, those genes will increase in the next generation, and those, of course, will be our adaptations. Probably one of the easiest ways to think about this process is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So we know in this case we have the antibiotic resistant gene, which would be our adaptation, and because those individuals survive when the antibiotics are taken, right, they can reproduce and they'll have a higher percentage in the next generation. So this is natural selection. You have certain heritable characteristics that increase survival and reproduction compared to other individuals. And it's the process by which those traits will increase in the population. But we also know that there are lots of factors that influence evolution that aren't just natural selection. So I already mentioned one in passing, which maybe you got caught. So if you can use that one, but come up with at least one other process that changes the genetic composition across generations. And then when you think you've come up with one, we'll proceed to the next slide. Usually people summarize these as to 4 different processes. And here I've included the definition of evolution to give you a chance. So you can pause the video, think up of what influences evolution other than natural selection. Okay, so here we have our overall change in our gene arrays from one time point to the next time point. And we would include all of that as evolution. And we've talked about how natural selection influences that. But you can see we have 3 other big players, right? One is genetic drift, which is just chance events. That means some genotypes get into the next generation and some don't. You go for a hike and you step on certain flowers, and those genes just don't get into the next generation. We also have migration, right? So maybe if we stick with plants, right, maybe a seed comes into a population from somewhere else, and therefore that changes the genetic composition. And then, of course, we have those cellular processes like mutation and recombination that will also lead to new genetic variation. So here, sometimes memes help, right? Because they put things in a sillier context, right? So if we have migration, mutation, and selection, drift is the one that often gets forgotten, or as it says in this meme, isn't treated as well, right? And that's just because drift is just chance events leading to changes in genetics. So here's our formal definition: genetic drift. Chance events determine which alleles pass to the next generation. Drift can be particularly important and have negative effects on small populations because you only have so many individuals in a small population. It's very easy to lose rare genotypes. And when that happens, when we lose an allele completely from a population, that is called fixation. So here we're looking at this figure from chapter 6, and we can see this simulation for different populations of this model where you start off with equal frequencies of both the big A and the little a allele, and then they just do model runs looking at just by chance alone, right? So certain individuals reproduce, others don't, not because of selection, just because of chance, or certain alleles get sorted during reproduction versus others. And what that ends up meaning is that in a lot of these cases, one allele gets fixed in the population. So in 7 of the runs, we get 100% of the population only having the big A allele, and in 5 of the runs only having the little a allele. And this is bad because we're losing genetic variation. So one more thing to explain drift to you and kind of contrast it with natural selection. Here's these little mice. This one mouse here I have named Joe. So Joe, maybe a mutation occurred, and so Joe has this new gene, and it's going to be favored by natural selection because it makes him more fit. He's going to have great survival, and he's going to be able to reproduce well. This is great genetics. So natural selection likes Joe. But sadly, Joe is unlucky. So a tree falls on him and he gets killed. And so this awesome gene just gets lost forever. And this is genetic drift, right? It's just a chance event that removes that gene from the population. And I purposefully chose one that another evolutionary process would favor, right? So just because we have certain genes in a population that selection favors doesn't mean, right, that they won't be lost because of drift. And this is why it can be so problematic for conservation when we get species down to very small numbers, because just by chance alone, you can lose certain individuals that may have the only copy of certain alleles, and so you start to have declines in genetic diversity. You can see this with the prairie chickens here, right, that in 1993, we were down to only 22 alleles across 6 genes, as opposed to if you look at the other states' populations of prairie chickens. And the consequence was of that was to have low reproduction. So you can see that in the percentage of the eggs that were hatched from these prairie chickens. So what they had to do in this case was bring in individuals from these other states to boost the genetic diversity. So genetic drift can influence evolution. Gene flow can as well. So we can think of gene flow as migration. We have individuals or their gametes moving into a new population and therefore providing new genes to that population. So in this figure, you can see that you have a mutation in this population up on the hillside that creates a new allele that provides resistance. This, of course, will be favored by selection, right? But then you have gene flow, you have migration of these mosquitoes down into these other populations, and because of that, over time, after that gene flow occurs, right, you will have selection that leads to an increase in that R allele over time because it provides that resistance to insecticides. So gene flow is, again, just that movement between populations. So why do we talk so much about natural selection if we have these 4 processes that influence evolution? The reason why is because natural selection is the process that results in adaptive evolution. So if we're focusing in particular on adaptations to different environments, we're going to naturally think about selection and not these other processes. So to recap, when we think about evolution, it's the change in the populations over time, right? Certain genotypes do better, others do worse. This can occur and does occur within populations. So remember in another video clip, we had that figure that talked about acclimation, right? So individuals can, grow more hair, right, or pant more if we're talking about dogs, things like that. So individuals can acclimate, right, but they can't evolve, right? So evolution occurs within the population when some individuals survive and reproduce and others don't. Natural selection, as we've seen, plays a really important role in evolution, but it's not the only factor. We have these 4 other things that, including drift, gene flow, right, and mutation and recombination that also influence evolutionary changes. But we focus on natural selection often because that's what creates adaptations. So when we talk about animal behaviors in a later lecture, we'll really be thinking about those behaviors as adaptations to the environment. But it's important to always realize that the genetics of species are influenced by these other three processes as well, and particularly genetic drift. So chance can play a very big role in what genes are present in the next generation.